What's up, amigos? I hope everyone is having a fantastic day. So in today's video, I wanted to go over some tips on just improving your character overall, specifically in terms of damage. So as simple as it may seem that you have to be strong enough to advance into later world tiers, it's not always that simple. Especially for casual players and newer players to the genre to understand how to get there. And hopefully in this video, I can educate and help people understand how to get there. So I don't want this to be an extremely lengthy video, but if it is, I apologize. But we are going to go over 3 key things to focus on when we are trying to build your character and progress through Diablo 4. In my what to do after 50 guide, I simply told you to focus on the basics. So let's take those basics and dive in depth a little bit more. So I will first off say, if you watched that video and came out a bit confused by how I worded the item progression, I am sorry, and let me explain this real fast. Always prioritize your scaling over item power and item tier. And what I mean is, if you have an item that has 3 affixes that scale your overall damage on a sacred item, it is not worth replacing it with an ancestral item that has only 1 affix that you can use with your build. Even though it is indeed a tier above and more item power, it is not worth it. Now there is an exception to this, and that's with weapons. Weapons give a substantial boost to your damage when you upgrade it from normal, sacred, to then ancestral. Once you are in those tiers, another example would be replacing a 600 DPS sword with 3 affixes that scale with your build with another sacred item that has 1 affix but 150 more DPS. In this case, it really boils down to the math and acknowledging if those affixes are conditional or not. What I mean by conditional is if you have % core damage and compare it to % damage to slowed enemies, the damage to slowed enemies would be conditional and is not a constant source of damage increase, as opposed to core damage, which is in fact a constant increase to your core skill. So things get tricky again when you talk about, let's say, Bleed, Whirlwind, Barb. Their affixes that you would think are conditional are not, because of their passives and expertise abilities, etc. So again, % damage to slowed enemies with Bleed Whirlwind is not conditional, it is actually constant, because they have a passive that slows enemies when they inflict bleed, and their Whirlwind hits always bleed. They always inflict a bleed. So now that I dove into that kind of topic, let's talk about affixes a bit more. Depending on your build, you need to understand how to scale your character through gear, and you don't have to be an expert, but you definitely have to do a bit of research and learn about your class a little bit if you want to progress sustainably through the content. So here I actually made a quick little infographic, and these are the most played meta builds and what affixes you should be looking for. They are not prioritized in any order, and there's also more situational affixes or conditional affixes that will scale with your damage, but these are the 5 key ones that I've listed. So just taking a quick look at this, we can actually see where the similarities are with each class. One of them is crit damage. Crit damage is a staple in every build, and crit chance is also pretty predominant in other builds, but there are rare exceptions like Landslide Druid, which isn't listed here, but they have a modifier called Terramotes that allow you to build up charges and consume them for guaranteed crits. Druids can also double dip on crit damage if they're earthen druids, because they can roll crit damage as a global and crit damage with earth skills. Now crit damage can be rolled on rings. Crit damage on earth skills I think can be rolled on gloves, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong in the comments down below. Crit chance can be rolled on gloves and rings. So I just want to say I left out the plus ranks in the infographic, but it is one of the most important stats for any build, and you will be looking for plus ranks to your main core skill on gloves, and you can also get plus ranks to certain skills on helmets. Example here is I have shadow imbuement ranks on mine. You can also get defensive and utility skills on pants. Plus ranks are always a great thing to go for. I personally opt not to have any on my pants to get extra damage reduction affixes. Core damage is another affix that scales so well with most builds, but again, some rare cases where it doesn't matter. One example here is Arc Lash. Arc Lash is actually a basic skill. It's not a core skill, so that affix does not benefit the build as much as others. For core damage, you're really looking for it on weapons. Now vulnerable damage. This is something that scales the most and is the most important stat usually for a lot of builds that have a great source of vulnerability infliction. Vulnerable status makes it so enemies take 20% more damage from you. You can look for this on rings and weapons. Now, cooldown reduction. Cooldown reduction is a crucial affix for a lot of builds, especially sorceresses and barbarians. You want to hit the cooldown cap for sorceress, and you want to try and hit that cooldown cap for barbarian so you can cycle your shouts. Now, this really just boils down to skills in Diablo 4 having pretty extreme cooldowns, which in my opinion need to be looked at across the board. But cooldown reduction isn't only good for whirlwind, barbs, and sorceresses, it's great for every class, honestly. So always look for cooldown reduction on your amulets and your helmets. Now, each affix you can roll on different pieces of gear, some roll on multiple pieces of gear. So it's up to you to determine where these stats are coming from, whether it's rings, gloves. Usually when it comes to offensive, they are coming from rings, gloves, weapons. And your more defensive rolls are going to be coming from your helmets, your chest pieces, your pants. And then your more mobility and alternative selections when it comes to affixes would be placed on amulets and your boots. Alright, so Blacksmith and Jeweler. Now, these two NPCs are incredibly important in overall character power. Upgrading your gear is crucial to development. Depending on your gear, you can upgrade between 3 to 5 times, each costing more mats and different types of materials. I have a separate video on learning how item power breakpoints and how important it is to understand for character progression. It will be linked in the description down below, and I'll pin it into the comment section as well. What we want to look at here is a little infographic from That Jumpy Jumps that I snagged from Reddit, and they do a fantastic job at simplifying this. Like, this graphic really is amazing for newer players, so shout out to Jumpy. So in the bottom left, you will see the Abstruse Sigil, Baleful Fragment, Coiling Ward, and Forgotten Souls. Abstruse Sigil you can only get from salvaging legendary jewelry, the Baleful Fragments from legendary weapons, the Coiling Wards from legendary armor. Forgotten Souls are something that you get from the Helltides. So you will need Abstruse Sigils, Baleful Fragments, and Coiling Wards when upgrading your gear. You will need a lot of these, so make sure to scrap worthless legendaries, never sell them. You make majority of your gold just from selling rares. Alright, so now let's discuss Paragon a little bit more. So Paragon is your endgame progression, something that matters the most, I feel. Each class has the up to 8 class boards, which I went over in my what to do after 50 video. Paragon is essential to your endgame setup, and if you aren't following a guide of some sort, it can definitely be overwhelming. My suggestion is, if you aren't following a guide and want to do things yourself, is to look at the preview of the boards, look at the rare nodes inside that board, and base your choice off of what you are currently after. So despite what us YouTubers say, there really isn't a right or wrong way to do Paragon, unless you, like, for whatever reason, slot only stats and never aim for a rare node or glyph. That could be wrong, but is also a really interesting idea for a video. But anyways, glyphs are incredibly strong, but granted tedious to fit in sometimes and level. And what upsets me about other creators and their builds is that they give you these Paragon layouts with fully leveled 15 glyphs in each board, which increases the radius. Now that takes a lot of Nightmare Dungeon farming, so don't fall for that bait. I'm not saying that the builds are bad, I'm saying that their Paragon guide, they're bad, and a lot of people are guilty of doing it. So try to figure it out for yourself. Some glyph locations are very heavy, for example on dex, whereas some are heavy on willpower, so it all depends on where you're mapping and what your board looks like. So make sure you map it out and you're certain you have enough stats that are required for the glyph around the location. And it is worth noting, another NPC to go back to the Blacksmith and Jeweler thing is the Occultist. The Occultist, you're going to be at them a lot. This is where you extract aspects, this is where you imprint aspects. Save your legendaries that have perfect rolls on aspects. So if you know that you're going to be replacing a piece of gear pretty soon, let's say a weapon, right? Let's boil it down to a weapon. Now, weapons from sacred to ancestral, again, those are big jumps. A lot of people will opt just to go and replace their weapon as soon as possible, whether it's a friend carrying you or if you're just about to make that jump. So what I was doing when I was leveling up is I was taking codex powers and imprinting them. And codex will give you the lowest value. Each aspect has a min to max value. If you don't know, you can actually go into the options and select advanced tooltips under the gameplay section to see those min to max rolls. I saved my max rolled aspects, I extracted them, and I saved those for when I knew I had a good ancestral weapon, which is quote unquote end game, and something that wouldn't be easily replaced. Until then, you are fine just using the lowest rolled aspects from your codex. So yeah, I want to wrap this video up. I wanted it to be short and sweet, but I also want it to be helpful. But I will be making more videos detailing character progression, and if you watch through the entire video, thank you so much. And if you wouldn't mind, hit that like button so this video can get out to more people. And until next time, amigos, take care.